Demoralize is outright terrible in Morrowind. And not how I said Frenzy sucked, no, Demoralize is pretty much a stinker in this game. Where to begin? Well, first of all, the whole idea of this spell kinda sucks, because unless they run off into the sunset, you will still have to deal with the demoralized enemy at some point. But I will admit that in a situation where you find yourself surrounded by enemies, it can save your hide. Except Demoralize works kinda oddly, which is why I wouldn't really rely on it. If you just cast it as is, it may do nothing. The enemy may just keep fighting you. It seems you need to back off a little bit, a few meters, to make them figure out that they should be running away. And then it should work. But that's not all. There's also this teeny tiny problem with how much it costs. Well, to be exact, it costs the exact same amount as Frenzy and Calm, but there's a problem. You see, Frenzy needs to have a high magnitude, true. But when the enemy gets aggressive, they will keep being aggressive, so Frenzy doesn't really need a very high duration. Calm, on the other hand, is fine with a fairly low magnitude. Actually, a magnitude of 30 is pretty much all that's needed for every enemy in the game. You may need a long duration, or you could admire the NPC into being permanently non-hostile. Learn about Frenzy and Calm in their respective videos. Anyway, Demoralize needs a fairly high magnitude to work, because what Demoralize does is it raises an attribute that only non-player entities have. That attribute is called Flee, fittingly enough. At 0 they will never flee, and at 100 they will always flee, which means you need to raise it fairly high to get them to run away. Some NPCs have a slightly higher flee value, so you may get away with a lower magnitude while still having it work on some enemies, but creatures? Well, let's just say that Demoralized creature is even worse than Demoralized humanoid. And in order for Demoralize to actually work in getting your enemies away from you, you will definitely need a duration that's not just 5 seconds. Because when it runs out, they may turn around and just continue fighting you. All in all, this means that for the spell to be effective in combat, you will need to put in a lot of magicka. Not to mention that, in vanilla, Demoralized humanoid has accidentally been put into mysticism. So if you aren't using a mod that fixes this, you effectively have to deal with 2 different schools of magic, for what is essentially just one effect. So let's see, it costs a lot of magicka, and because it's expensive, it's hard to cast. Which all means that it's basically unavailable at lower levels, where it could be the most useful. And it's fiddly and unreliable to work with. Sometimes even when you do everything right, it just doesn't work. You know what? If you want enemies to run away, I have another suggestion. You should use either invisibility or levitation while in combat. It's cheaper, you don't need 2 separate spells, and it always works. As you know, it's NATO military doctrine to establish air superiority as the first step in a war. So it only makes sense to use NATO doctrine in Morrowind too, and use levitation as your first combat move. It makes perfect sense, no? Demoralize actually works properly in Oblivion. It's a level dependent spell, so the things you cast it on need to be either at or below the level of the spell. Except if the level of the spell is 25, in which case it works on everything, assuming you aren't wearing armor. In Skyrim it's called Fear. It's more or less the same, but the level of the spell can be increased by perks and dual casting. I would still prefer other spells in those games, but at least it works. For more terrible content just like this, see this playlist. Also, if you stumble on my illusion ranking video, ignore where I place Demoralize. I underestimated just how bad it is. Thanks for watching.